Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about clinical trials, and then what I'm going to do is break through and discuss what currently is ongoing with respect to clinical research across the country. I'm going to use City of Hope as the model to sort of look at how we break our clinical trial portfolio. But certainly what we're going to present today should be replicated at most large sarcoma centers throughout the country. Okay, so when we talk about clinical trials, what are we talking about? And so we are talking about a group of carefully designed medical research studies conducted with people that are looking to test promising diagnostic, treatment, and prevention methods, and really to answer a scientific question. When I think about clinical research, what I'm thinking about is what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish whether or not something works, and so that subsequently it could be rolled out and used in everyone. And so it's a small group of patients predominantly that will help the entire sarcoma community if these drugs come to market. And so who sponsors clinical trials and how are they paid for? So pharmaceutical corporations will help. Often they will help provide funding for investigators to do investigational new drugs, or the pharmaceutical companies themselves will, am I doing, okay. Will have the investigational new drugs. In academic medical centers, we do investigator-initiated trials where we have collaboration with pharmaceutical companies as well as other organizations in order to fund the research that we think will benefit our sarcoma community. If you could go back one. Okay, and then the National Cancer Institute. So within the United States and within most countries of the world, there are these cooperative groups where different organizations will join to conduct research in order to answer important medical questions. So the type of clinical trials that we have interventional trials that have both treatment and prevention. There are trials that look at quality of life and often involve questionnaires and trying to understand how patients are doing through it. And then there are often clinical trials that are looking to screen as well in order to try to catch something before it becomes a problem. So why are clinical trials important? It certainly is the basis for most of us in academic practice of what we're trying to involve our patients in. And the reason we're doing it is we are trying to advance the standard of care for cancer treatments. We saw from Dr. Forster that there are a number of treatments available to patients, but in some of those categories near the end that he was talking about, there's one drug. There aren't multiple drugs. And what we're trying to establish is if one doesn't work for everybody, what is the second one? What is the third? And so when he had the slide up at the end and we saw 5 drugs approved for GI stromal tumors, well, that is certainly a huge advance. Had we had that slide placed up 3 years ago, we would have had 3 drugs. Had we had the slide placed up 30 years ago, we would have had no drugs. And so certainly the advances in clinical research allows us to gain access for patients to therapeutics that will work for them and improve survival. And so we're also doing clinical trials to understand disease processes. For anybody who's been involved in a clinical trial, there are often a number of questions that get asked. And the questions typically are, if there's extra tissue left over, can it be kept for clinical research or for investigations? If there's any blood left, can we use it for other investigations? So as we get the patients into these clinical trials, we're also trying to establish what else we could learn about the disease, because here we'll get tissue or blood from X number of patients with all the same condition. And so we're trying to figure a lot out there. And clinical trials are as important because the FDA will not approve drugs without clinical trials to show benefit. So in 1948 was the first randomized controlled trial. It was streptomycin versus placebo for pulmonary tuberculosis. And then randomized clinical trials are done. So we try to randomize patients so that we don't have a bias, so that you're not putting a patient into one category versus another. We're trying to often blind it. And so often they're double blinded in the sense that the patients and the investigators don't know what treatment the patients are getting. And we also have some randomizations. They're typical in phase 3 trials, but sometimes in phase 2 as well. So the leading cause of death over time has certainly changed. We saw in the 1900s that pneumonia or influenza was the #1 cause of death. In 2020, this is updated from the CDC, we see that cancer ranks as #2. And so in 1900, it was #8. And so certainly over time, it has continued to become a major health crisis and something that we need to continue to do research on. So what have we learned? So we know that certainly race, gender, ethnicity can be risk factors for certain malignancies. We know in early 2000, we had the discovery of the Human Genome Project, which has really changed the way we see genetics and cancer. And we know that emerging therapies lead to targeted treatments, often with fewer side effects. And I believe later today we'll have a talk on immunotherapy as well. And so certainly seeing how different classes of drug has really taken over how we treat patients. So how do you develop a new drug? So drugs are developed certainly by doing laboratory research to try to understand a compound and create a compound. It then gets taken to animal testing, and then it gets moved to clinical trials in humans. Most of the clinical trials we run are phase 1, which would be first in human, trying to understand the drug, trying to understand the side effects of the drug, and trying to understand what dosing of the drug to use for patients. Phase 2 is when we know the dose of the drug, we understand some of the side effect profiles of it, we know how to give it, and therefore you're testing to see whether or not there's efficacy. Phase 3 is when you start to compare it, often to standard of care, and then you're trying to figure out, is this drug better than standard of care? Is it equivalent? What is the role? And phase 4, which is not a common thing for most of us to do, is post-marketing research. So it's looking at certain aspects of drugs after they've already come to market. So the phase 1 are the first studies in people to test the safety of a drug. The phase 2 is trying to determine, is the drug effective? Phase 3 is trying to compare the investigational drug with a standard of care treatment. Phase 4 is ongoing safety data, usually a post-FDA approval. So how do clinical trials get initiated at most centers? So in academic medical centers, what happens is you have a protocol that is submitted to an academic center. Each academic centers or the NCI designated cancer centers have disease team committees. And so these would be committees of people that are invested in, let's just use sarcoma as an example. So people who are invested in sarcoma. So it would be anybody doing research in sarcoma, the pathologist, the radiologist, the surgeons, medical oncologists, and radiation oncologists and pharmacists. And so as a disease team, you would look to see the value of this study for the patient population that you have. You want to make sure that you are bringing in studies for patients that come to your practice, and you're also looking to make sure that you're not duplicating and having too many studies all asking the same question. Following the disease committee review, you would send to a scientific review committee and the institutional review board, which is like the ethics committee, to make sure that the research being done is ethical for patients. And then essentially the trial gets initiated and you start with patient enrollment. So trial success rates have changed over time, and it really depends on the clinical phase. But for all therapeutic areas, the percent approval of clinical trials from phase 3 studies is about 13%. We see in oncology, there are a number of trials that get done where the drugs don't get approved. And so the approval success rates is quite low, and this is dating back to 2019. And so it certainly means that there is room for improvement. So there are many myths. When I sit in a room with a patient, the first thing they tend to talk about when I discuss a clinical trial is that they don't want a placebo. And so placebo studies are quite rare. They're not that common to be used in clinical trials. They get used sometimes if there's no established standard of care, or if the feeling is that waiting usually 6 to 8 weeks on a placebo would be safe for a patient, then it could be used. But it's not standard to have placebos as part of most clinical trials. I'd say less than 10% of the trials we run have placebos incorporated in it. The next myth is that clinical trials are not safe. And so really each step in drug development is highly regulated to ensure the safety and protection of research participants. All of today's best cancer treatments were once clinical trials. And so if you're offered any drug that is FDA approved, it's not FDA approved for any other reason than the fact that there was a clinical trial that proved it. So clinical trials are really highly regulated. And so for most patients, these are safe. If I consent to a clinical trial, I can't read the top of my slide. I don't know if you could remove that. Oh, I lose, thank you. If I consent to a clinical trial, I lose the chance to receive more effective standard treatments. And so the consent process is not a legally binding document. It is just the willingness of a participant to participate in a clinical trial. At any time, they could withdraw that. But standard treatments are always available to patients. Patients may withdraw participation in a clinical trial at any time for any reason. This is about patient care, and so the patient's rights always come first. Participating in a clinical trial means that there is no hope. And so this is a misconception. We often do clinical trials as first-line therapy for patients who have had no treatments. We use them as second, third, fourth line. So clinical trials are available for all stages of cancer, including newly diagnosed and untreated patients. And it doesn't mean that there is no hope. It means that there essentially is hope, and we're trying to improve upon what we already have established. So how do you enter a clinical trial? There are eligibility criteria, and there's an informed consent process. The informed consent is the opportunity to learn about potential benefits and side effects. It is not a contract. It's an open dialogue between patients and clinicians and the clinical team to get information and see if it is right for you. So the potential benefits of clinical research is to gain access to advanced treatments, to potentially for extending treatment options. And so if we look at GI stromal tumors in Dr. Forscher's slide that had 5 drugs available, well, if you've used all 5 drugs, what is next? So you could certainly use other drugs that are FDA approved for other indications, or often you would enter a clinical trial in order to give you access to extra lines of therapy. The study treatment does come at no cost. So the cost thing is an interesting thing. So the payment for clinical trials, the drugs themselves that are being evaluated and are not FDA approved or FDA approved for another indication are provided by the study. But there is a fee, your insurance or the patients would have to cover anything that is considered standard of care or for safety purposes. Anything for research alone is covered by the study traditionally. It's all mandated by Medicare guidelines. The other benefit is that as patients, you're able to contribute to the advancements of medicine, and you're able to take a leading role in how we treat our patients and what happens in the long run. The risks, though, are the potential for unknown side effects of the study treatments. Most studies that we currently do have additional time than standard therapies, and so patients are often required to be on campus for much longer than if they were not in clinical trials. And unfortunately, the study treatments may be ineffective, but that's no different than any therapy that we try. Unfortunately, nothing we have works in every single patient. So who is watching out for patients' interests? So certainly the FDA is governing all the clinical trials. The NCI has a heavy role in this as well. Each institution will have review boards, which is an ethics committee that is making sure that the research being done is ethical and appropriate. And then your physician or investigator is also watching out. And there are data safety committees that are independent, that are reviewing the data to make sure that the treatments are continuing to be safe. So I certainly think when you're in front of your physicians and your advanced practice providers, you need to know what your options are. You need to ask the questions. So certainly asking what your other options are is a good thing. So if you decided not to do the clinical trial, what would your physician or nurse practitioner recommend? Knowing who put the study together, so who's responsible for the study, where else the trial is being conducted, what will I get out of the study, what are the risks, how long will the study last, and then certainly understanding what tests are involved. So after you start a study, you don't end up surprised by all the appointments that you're going to have at the facility. So I think there are several ways to find clinical trials for sarcomas. Certainly speaking with your physician or physician providers would be important. Reaching out to an academic medical center in your area will likely have the most number of sarcoma trials for you. And you could always go online to www.clinicaltrials.gov. And then once you're on clinicaltrials.gov, what you would do is you would put in the disease you're looking for. So here I just pre-populated with sarcoma. I chose United States, I chose California, and then Duarte is where City of Hope is. And so what you would do is you would look here, and then all of a sudden you would get a list of the trials you're looking for. It's often hard to determine which ones would be good for you. On the left-hand side, there's often an area where you could click on for actively recruiting, and those would be clinical trials that are open in your area. So shifting gears and focusing now on what would I consider exciting currently going on right now. So there are a number of cutting edge treatments available to sarcoma patients. And I think we're at a very exciting time. And I sort of broke these up into different sections. I'm focusing on what we have available here at City of Hope. But certainly this would be replicated at Sylvester Cancer Center in Miami. This gets replicated at Northwestern in Chicago. And so as you see other people speaking today,
I'm not on call this weekend.
They would have similar portfolios. And so the way I sort of broke it up is, so what do we do for first line treatments of patients who have had no therapies? And so currently we do have 2 clinical trials for patients that are untreated with the most common sarcoma drug that we have, which is Doxorubicin. And so we have a study of NOX66 plus Doxorubicin in patients who have never received Doxorubicin for their soft tissue sarcomas. The drug itself is idronoxil, which is it's a suppository formulation, and the purpose is to sensitize cancer cell lines and add to the effects of the chemotherapy. And so that's currently ongoing at a number of centers throughout the United States. And then we also have APX005M, which is done again at a number of centers, and this is a CD40 agonistic monoclonal antibody that stimulates the anti-tumor immune response. And so essentially what we're trying to do is use our immune system to help fight the cancer in addition to the doxorubicin. And so it's exciting to have treatments for patients who have never had any treatments before. And so back to the question of, if you offer someone a clinical trial, does that mean there are no hope? Well, certainly not. We're taking standard of care and we're trying to build upon it. We also are doing a lot of advances in T-cell therapy. And so what is T-cell therapy? It's a method to get the immune cells known as T-cells, which is a type of white blood cell, to fight cancer by, I can't read my slides, by altering them in order to destroy cancer cells. So what we're trying to do is get people's immune system to help fight the cancers. And so there are 2 clinical trials that we currently have ongoing. One is a master protocol to assess the safety and anti-tumor activity of genetically engineered T cells in NY-ESO-1 or LAG-1A positive tumors. And the second is the Spearhead study, which is looking at patients with synovial sarcoma or myxoid round cell liposarcoma. What's exciting about these T-cell therapies is we are anticipating potentially that they will come to market and have availability for synovial sarcoma patients. So going on the synovial sarcoma study, so if you can't get into a T-cell therapy or if that is not the right protocol for you, what else do we have? Well, we currently have a study of ASP 0739, which is given for patients with NY-ESO-1 expressing tumors. And so that would be like a synovial sarcoma or a myxoid round cell liposarcoma. And so this is using a artificial adjuvant vector cell targeting NY-ESO-1 tumor antigen, and it's administered intravenously, and patients get this once a month for 6 times. Other studies we have currently, we're looking at BRD9. So BRD9 is a good target for patients with synovial sarcoma. or for synovial sarcoma and SMARCB1 null tumors. And so there are two drugs that we have. One is the FHD 609, which is a protein degrader of BRD9. And the other one is an oral drug that, again, is targeting BRD9 for the treatment of cancers that are dependent on this pathway. So this is a pathway that promotes the cells to grow, the cells to metastasize. And so both of these would be good for patients with synovial sarcomas and, again, open across the country. We also open studies for rare histologies, and so these are important for patients who have rare sarcomas. Sarcomas as a whole are rare, and within sarcomas, we have these rare histologies. And so we do have a phase 1, phase 2 study that's currently going into the phase 2, which is using CPI 613 in combination with hydroxychloroquine for patients with clear cell sarcoma. And so while this is not a lot of patients, this is certainly advantageous for those who have this. And it is open for patients 12 years of age and older, so it is for the pediatric population as well. And this is, the drug itself is designed to target the mitochondria of cancer cells in order to disrupt their energy production and cutting off the fuel for disease growth, and so really shutting down the tumor cells. We have drugs for, we have an alliance study, which is a cooperative group study for patients with angiosarcomas. And this is using paclitaxel and nivolumab, which is an immunotherapy drug. Also for rare histologies, we have studies for desmoid tumors. So we have AL102, which is a gamma secretase inhibitor that turns off the cell proliferation, survival, and invasion pathways, and hopefully will serve our patients who have desmoid tumors well. And then someone before mentioned tenosynovial giant cell tumors. We also have the MOTION study, which is vimseltinib, which is a CSF1R kinase inhibitor, which targets the on-off switch pocket of cellular processes and is orally administered and highly effective. And so this is, I believe, versus placebo for patients in this situation. And this is done throughout the entire world. It's an international study. We have a number of target-driven studies. And so the one on our left-hand side is using a drug called rogoratinib, and it's specifically for patients with advanced sarcomas with an alteration in the FGFR1 to 4 receptor, or for patients who have an SDH-deficient gastrointestinal stromal tumor. And so this is a group of patients that at one point were called wild type. So it is oral, it is highly potent, it's a small molecule inhibitor of the fibroblastic growth factor receptor. We have a study of ASTX-295, which is for patients with wild type P53. And so an abnormality in P53 is often a driver for patients with sarcomas, and over 50% of patients will have that abnormality. For patients who don't have a P53 mutation, they potentially are able to receive this drug. Specifically what it's looking at, it's a small molecule designed to block the interaction of MDM2 and P53 and to restore P53 function. And so it's really geared for patients with an MDM2 abnormality. And then we also have a drug, abemaciclib, for the treatment of advanced bone and soft tissue sarcomas who have a CDK pathway alteration. And so Dr. Forscher mentioned a similar drug for patients with liposarcoma. And so here is one for patients who don't have liposarcoma that potentially will benefit as well. And so this is an oral agent. And then we also are opening up this study here, looking at patients who have a TSC1 or TSC2 mutation. And this will look at 120 patients using nab-sirolimus, which is currently approved for PCOMAs. And now we're trying to find an alternative use for this drug. And so there'll be two arms of this study. One is with a TSC1 alteration for 60 patients, and one is a TSC2 alteration, which is 60 patients. The way you'll know if you have a TSC1 or 2 alteration is by a NGS panel. And so if your tumor is sent for genetic testing, this would get picked up. And so this will be open shortly at our site with a primary endpoint of looking at a response. And then we also always will look at duration of response. We look how the overall survival, and we're always looking at quality and safety as well. And so this will be opened across the country as well. And then we also have studies for common histologies. The most common histology we see is leiomyosarcoma. And so we have cabozantinib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor with temozolomide, and that's for the treatment of patients with unresectable or metastatic leiomyosarcoma, whether it's uterine or non-uterine. And then also we have for patients who have other soft tissue sarcomas. And then we have a phase 2/3 study that will be looking at a drug called BI 907-828. Compared to doxorubicin for first-line treatment of patients with advanced dedifferentiated liposarcoma. And so that will be exciting for patients with that diagnosis, which is probably the second or third most common diagnosis we see. And so certainly all academic medical centers and sarcoma centers of excellence will have websites available that will have information. This is the website at City of Hope. And it always takes a village to do anything we want to do. This is my village. Some of them are here. And so working collaboratively to do better by our patients is always what our goals are. It's an honor to work in this environment. So I will take any questions.
Any questions from anyone in the audience? Just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the mic. Were there any online, Dr. DiDamato, that you saw? Nothing? Okay. So let me give you the mic, or you can go up there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agulnik.